I enjoyed our last meetings always greatly, and they're a good way for me actually to return to some of the topics that I find interesting, but that I don't do in my day-to-day business. To return some questions that are philosophically interesting. And the way I set these lectures up is most of the time I want to trigger some thoughts in you. So as the last couple of times, I won't come up with a final conclusion or something like that. I want to make you think about bigger philosophical questions, and also like to give you some methodology at hand and some discussions. And today we might have a very narrow topic at hand, but you will see that it is one of the most important philosophical topics, and it depends on the framing, actually, the way you approach that question. So let's see, we called it so far, is there a duty to obey an unjust law? But we will see that we will end up with much bigger questions than the law. So it is one of the most fundamental and crucial questions in philosophy. And as I've said in the past, you can always use the chat on the side. Somehow I have trouble with my keyboard today, so I'm not sure I can type, but like I will always monitor the chat on the side. So feel free to use that actively. And that's kind of the structure that I want to do today. Unfortunately, I have to start with definitions. I usually don't like that, but in the case of duty to obey the law, I think it is very handy to understand before what we are talking about, because there are certain features that we have to understand philosophically that are usually in social discourse used in a different way. Okay, so I want to first kind of discuss what I mean here by the law, what are features of the law, and why is it relevant to talk about the law from a philosophical perspective? Because you might say, okay, why are you talking about the law? You're not a legal scholar, you're not like a lawyer. So let's look at that. Then compliance and obedience is something that I will flesh out. And lastly, I think maybe something that is also interesting to especially you. So I picked that in because I know the Russian context a little bit, and sometimes there's a confusion between a rule of law and a rule by law. And I think that is very relevant to the philosophical discussion there. That might help more. Then we dive into two subsections. One will be on civil disobedience, and I will explain why I picked that. Because when we're talking about unjust laws, you have to end up with civil disobedience. I will elaborate on this a little bit. And then I think I will spend most time on the big question of political obligation and political authority, because ultimately that's where you end. I have one little conclusion to do in the end, but that's kind of presenting my own thoughts on the topic. So let's see where that goes. But before we dive into, I prepared a little Menti to see the mood and the room a little bit in terms of where you stand on this particular question. So you go to menti.com and you use the code 9368445. So I cannot unfortunately type because my keyboard just was striking on me. So if somebody types that in the chat, that might also be handy, but the code is 9368445. Let me just jump back. So yeah. 9368445. And I will quickly have to reshare my screen because I have to jump to the browser. Okay, good. People are very quick. They are quicker than I can switch screens, in fact. So, is there a duty to obey an unjust law? Give me your intuition. Again, you don't necessarily have to argue yet for it. Yeah, perfect. Thanks, Anna and Tarina, for it. Perfect. Good. Let's see. I give it like a couple more seconds. Give me just your rough intuition. Is there a duty to obey an unjust law? Okay, we see an equal spread. Okay, good. Actually, that's a very interesting starting point. 5 people think that there's a duty to obey, and 6 people think that there's a duty to obey an unjust law. Puts a harder task on me, even, you know. So let's see. The second question: is there a duty to obey the law in general? Okay, and by that I mean philosophically. I don't like. I don't say, you know, oh, go out and break the law. That's not what I'm saying. Philosophically, would you have a duty to obey the law? So even if you say no, I don't expect that you just like break the law now every time you do. Is there generally a duty to obey the law? Okay. Well, I can't separate this audience from a German audience. It seems like roughly the same outcome. You know, 9 people think that there's a general duty to obey the law. That's encouraging to a certain degree. Okay, I'll give it a couple more seconds. But I mean, we have a vast majority, so that's something I can work with. Actually, I have to work much harder now, as it seems, if I have to work with a lot of people who actually say that there is a duty to obey even an unjust law. 6 of you. So let's see. That's some definitions and why this is relevant in the philosophical debate. Well, there you go. If we talk about the features of the law, you will immediately say why this is a relevant question. So when we talk about the law and the legal norms, sometimes that works actually better, the term legal norms, because the law we immediately associate with the state, right? But as we will see later, it's not necessarily the case. But let's say the law has these features. The first one is that it gives us prima facie duties, which means that these duties always apply unless there are very strong overriding reasons. Okay, prima facie just means that it can be overwritten only if there are very good reasons to do so, but otherwise it applies. So the law applies unless very other overriding conditions apply. So for example, you might have the obligation to stop at a red traffic light. However, once you're rushing to save your grandma's life or whatsoever, you might, and there's nobody on the street, there is an overriding duty to save your grandma, right? So you have a prima facie reason to override your initial obligation. Okay, so prima facie just means that the law applies unless there is overriding reasons. And here we come already into certain considerations about the initial question, duty to obey an unjust law, because a lot of people might say that the law making immoral demands from us is already overriding. Okay, so if I would have to do something that is immoral, that I cannot do, and like for example would violate my deepest moral beliefs, then that's an overriding reason, so a prima facie reason. So I could basically end my reason here, because basically nobody argues that you have to like obey an unjust law, but we are not yet there, but that's already a strong consideration. Second, very straightforward, the law applies to everybody universally, so that's how it's set up, like everybody who is. So if we think about the law as something issued by the government, then everybody in that territory is under the spell of the law. It's comprehensive, in the sense that it applies in its full scheme. So comprehensive means the law, you cannot cherry pick law. You cannot say, oh, I obey the law that I like. You know, that's not obeying the law. You cannot cherry pick the law. Like either you obey the whole framework or you don't obey, right? Like you cannot cherry pick from it. And this is important here. The law is content independent. So again, if the law applies, if there is a duty to obey the law, it is independent of the content that the law prescribes, right? The law is giving you an obligation because it is the law, not because the content of the law is giving you something. So here's an example. You might think that the law gives me an obligation not to murder. However, that seems wrong, right? Because even if the law is not there, you seem to have an obligation not to murder. The obligation is independent from the content of the law. However, if the law really has authority over you, and that's something we will flesh out later, then the content of the law doesn't matter. It is giving you an obligation because it is the law. The fact that it is the law, that the law is the law, gives you obligation, okay? Not the content of the law. It's crucial. So the same way that you should not murder is something that the law gives you an obligation, it might also give you an obligation to pay your taxes, okay? Doesn't matter what the content is. If you apply it in a comprehensive manner, applicable to everybody, always applicable unless prima facie reasons to override it, then no matter the content, it is applicable. Okay, and that's, I think, the common features of the law. Again, yeah, Daniel has a question about specific laws like MP's immunity and stuff. We will talk about it in a second when I talk about the rule of law and rule by law. But these are general features, so that I want to have out. So when I talk about the law, I basically nail it down to like these 4 dimensions, okay? Prima facie, only if there are overriding reasons, it doesn't apply. Universally applicable to everybody. It's comprehensive, you cannot cherry pick, and it's content independent. If the law is the law, then it doesn't matter whether it prescribes you taxation or criminal cases, okay? So that's it. That's how I will use the law. Second, I think we have to distinguish between compliance and obligation. I already used the word obligation now a couple of times. And by obligation, I mean that you get certain duties from the law because it is the law, right? That's obligation. It creates duties in you. If you have authority, you can create obligation in others. Okay, that's what the law does. The law generates obligations in us. For example, the obligation not to murder. Okay, it gives us an obligation, or the obligation to pay taxes. Okay, that's different than compliance. Compliance is something you do out of self-interest. You comply with the law because you don't want to get fined. So that's different, right? It's not that it gives you a duty. That's much, much stronger. So if we argue here, should you comply with the law? Of course, especially like in your country, and especially in the country I live in, I urge you to comply with the law. Okay, please, but I'm doing here the philosophical question, and the philosophical question is about obligation and whether it creates duties to you. Okay, so that's what I will talk about. I will not talk about compliance with the law. I will talk about the more philosophical question of obligations that the law creates. Again, it sounds trivial. This is crucial, right? Like everything I talk about is on a fundamental philosophical level, not whether you should not break the law or something. That's a question I'm not the best to answer. Third distinction is I talk about the rule of law many times, or like liberals love to talk about it. In fact, they love to talk about the rule of law. So let me just get that out so that we know a little bit about what rule of law in a political context mean. Well, the rule of law is a value that basically stands for the constraint of those in power by principles, laws, and rules. Okay, so liberals tend to be very skeptical of power structures, and in fact, I would say most political ideologies that we now perceive as in the mainstream are very skeptical towards power structures. They grant only power in society once you have very strong constraints. That's a core pillar of liberalism, for example. If there's power structures that we give, especially political, like that we give some people authority over others, we constrain them, not only by other people constraining them, but we constrain them by institutions. For example, a division of power, right? Separation of power in Montesquieu, but also just much more fundamental by having the law out there, okay? And that has certain features. If you want to read out on that, like, I don't want to make it too technical. I just want to say that there are clear rules to the rule of law. You can read Joseph Raz. I think he has just a couple of nice shorter papers on the rule of law that makes a couple of core points. For example, that the law should be general, the law should be clear, the law should be public, so publicly available. If you wouldn't know the law, obviously it's very hard to enforce it. Should be inclusive, it should be stable, non-discretionary, so not like jumping over time, procedural, so the way it comes about, independent in terms of who makes the law, right? If the government would also make the law, how could it be constrained by law? But again, these are very technical definitions. However, it gives me a segue to quickly talk about Daniel's questions about immunity of MPs. Well, this is something hotly debated, I guess. Within this narrow conception of the rule of law, there might not be a good case to be made for immunity. However, I think we seem to grant that certain features you grant authority over time. So I think actually a good question to ask. I wouldn't know what Raz says about it, but again, that's a good narrow area where principles of the law are violated, because here some general principles applicable to everybody are not used, right? There are some exemptions. And whether that's justifiable within this narrow conception of the rule of law, certainly not. Okay. So this, however, could be abused many times, the rule of law. I put here certain friends, not friends of the family of liberalism out there, because they also obviously love to use the word rule of law, but they don't use the rule of law the way I just described it. They use what I call, and many others call, the rule by law. Okay, and the rule by law means that they literally make the argument that you have to obey the law because it is the law. That's rule by law. You basically say, here's a law, and you have to obey it because it is the law. Okay, and that's different than what I just described. I said, well, you might have in the rule of law framework a duty to obey specific laws that are just, okay? And here's a conception of what makes for a somehow just law, okay? I just sketched them here roughly. That's what liberals understand as the rule of law. So a law has no force by itself in most of the times in a liberal framework, but we will also later see in a moral framework. So don't get confused when people talk about the rule of law and the rule by law. You hopefully now understood already from my introductory remarks that there's a difference, whether you have a duty to follow a specific law because it is the law, or whether it is because it arose in a just manner or it reflects justice or whatsoever. It's crucial to understand, because this poses a question of political authority. And that's something we will tackle in most of the talk later on. But let me just briefly interject with one thing. Yeah, Ivan asked a question about what I deserve from the government. I will talk a little bit later about that, so I will hold that in the queue. There's an argument about fair play, and I will touch upon that. So this whole question about the duty to obey the law is actually very complicated. Okay, some people, as we already saw, confuse different terminologies, but now we should be on the same page. I separated my talk onto two things. You can accept the authority of the law, as many of you do. In fact, most of you seem to be very law obedient. It comes as a certain surprise to me, but I mean, my German soul is kind of springing in joy, but on other points, I might want to convince you later on afterwards in another direction. Okay, so if you accept authority from the law, then, well, I think this plays a crucial role, because how do we get from a framework of rule by law, where there are many unjust laws that we don't want to obey, to a rule of law framework? And here is something that many people have already heard about, but it is rarely well conceptualized, namely the topic of civil disobedience. And I will explain that. People like John Rawls have talked about that too. Skepticism about authority. So this is where I have to, I think, do my most heavy working, because most people seem to accept the general authority of the law already. However, I want to make you a little bit skeptical about the power of the law. In fact, I will arrive at the end at kind of at least narrowingly sketching what is called philosophical anarchism. Don't worry, I won't like say like Molotov cocktails and stuff, but I will touch upon something that will show you that a lot of the people in the philosophical community are skeptical about political obligation and whether the law by itself has any normative force. Okay, so we will talk about the big question of political obligation. And here you can already see that this trivial question of is there a duty to obey an unjust law poses the most fundamental political questions. Actually, this question is always a segue into the discussion whether the state is authoritative to a certain degree. Okay, so if you want to go back to, for example, Socrates, in Socrates' dialogues in Crito, you already find the skepticism towards political obligation, one of the most fundamental philosophical puzzles, and I will explain all of that. So let us start with, however, the more narrow, the more practical oriented part, namely civil disobedience. And civil disobedience is something that we already know, I guess, from activists like Gandhi or Luther King, right? Like if you heard about civil disobedience, you heard about that. They didn't obey certain laws because they deemed them to be unjust, right? That is how we know it. However, there's also an intellectual tradition. I mean, Henry David Thoreau is a very strong proponent of that. Tolstoy was also somebody who heavily influenced people thinking about civil disobedience. In fact, if you look at Luther King's writings, he explicitly named both of them, right? Thoreau as well as Tolstoy. So what do we mean when we talk about civil disobedience, and why does it play a role when we talk about the duty to obey the law? Well, civil disobedience is basically you are strategically disobeying the law. Okay, and that's crucial. You're not just waking up in the morning and say, oh, I don't want to pay my taxes, you know. So I'm disobeying the law. Now I'm on equal footing with these people, you know. Like I don't want to pay my taxes. I'm like on the same stage as like Martin Luther King and like Mahatma Gandhi. Okay, that's not a disobedience of the law that we are talking about. Civil disobedience has very clearly defined features, as almost anything in philosophy. First, it has to have a political aim. So you cannot just say like, I don't want to pay my taxes, therefore I disobey the law, right? Like, what's the bigger political agenda? Maybe you are a hardcore anarcho-capitalist and you think like the biggest evil is really taxation, then at least you have the political aim. But again, even then, this is not really civil disobedience, although you could make the case. So I don't want to trash on that too hard. So it has to be somehow in a political aim. It needs to be immediate in terms of tangibility. That's how many people call it, in terms of immediate political change, could be at least on the horizon, which maybe is challenging this whole anarcho-capitalist story to disobey tax payments. It is civil, so it's not only disobedience, it's civil, so that therefore it is non-violent. Okay, crucial. That's why also, of course, Luther King, Gandhi, we know all of this. This is like part of it, why it's also called civil disobedience. It is used as a tactical tool of how to obey the law. Again, this is different from other forms of disobedience. You nowadays see a lot of, in the social justice literature, like the hardcore, like social justice literature, I don't talk about John Rawls or whatever, but like revolutionary strands, right? Revolutionary strands are different from civil disobedience. Civil disobedience accepts the legal framework of the law. It accepts the authority of the law, at least most of them, okay? They accept the authority of the law. However, they want to have change in the legal structure. Okay, crucial. So they don't want to overturn the full law. They don't see it as an artifact of whatever bourgeois morality that you want to overcome, tear everything down. So civil disobedience, again, has political aims, but these are very narrow and with immediate effect. So it's something tangible. You don't have to change the whole system. Second, non-violent. So you don't want to like overthrow the whole system. So it's non-revolutionary in a sense. Next one, it is public. You cannot be engaging in civil disobedience and do it in private. So, you know, like you cannot be the hero of withholding taxes again, but like doing it in private, you know, it has to have a public dimension to it because you want to change the legal structure. So you have to disobey in public. That's why Rosa Parks, of course, in public disobeyed, for example, sitting on a specific seat in the bus, right? Like these have to be public acts to change these political structures or legal norms by having public discourse about it. So it's very strategic in the way it is approached. I hope you see that by now. So civil disobedience has fundamental pillars to it. It has to be deliberate, so conscientious. So you cannot accidentally do civil disobedience. So it has to have an intentionality to it. You cannot say, oh, I forgot to pay my taxes. Now I am like, again, a hero of like civil disobedience, right? Like it has to be deliberate. It has to be also principled. Okay. So it comes from a certain reasoning. It doesn't mean that you have to have a full theory about it, but it should reflect certain principles that you have, certain normative stances. Okay, and these are common features what makes civil disobedience civil disobedience. Let me just quickly open the chat on the side. Okay, I will explain that in a second, Daniel. So this is civil disobedience, the overall framework. And the role of civil disobedience is, well, people don't want to overthrow the system. The people who want to engage in civil disobedience don't want to overthrow the whole legal system, right? They don't want to overthrow the state. They don't want to change overall power structures. They accept the general normative drive of the law. They accept the general framework which this is taking in, but they have problems with certain aspects of the law. And civil disobedience is the way to change the law in, some might say, in a liberal society, okay? Because first it is non-political, non-violent, it has a very clear, deliberative public role. It is deliberate and based on certain principles, right? I will now tackle a little bit to Daniel's question, whether this infers that people have to accept the authority of the law. That is less a theoretical remark than more, I would say, a practical remark that most people who engage in civil disobedience would, I guess, say, accept some sort of argument why the law has authority per se. But I don't think it is theoretical necessity. So you can be like, I would say, that's kind of my position. I'm skeptical about authority, about the law, but I nevertheless think civil disobedience is a good tool. So I don't think you necessarily have to tie them theoretically together, if that makes sense. However, of course, it kind of makes sense to at least assume that there's authority to the law and then engage in civil disobedience, at least from a more pragmatic point of view. I will contextualize that later once we know exactly what it means to be skeptical about authority. So I hope that makes sense. So this is civil disobedience, and let me just quickly return. So if you have the general intuition that, well, I generally have an argument and I accept the authority of the law, well, civil disobedience is for one way for you how you might actually have a duty to disobey unjust laws, right? Because what I just sketched is, if you believe that the law plays an important role and even has authority, then you might even have a duty to engage in civil disobedience because it will make the law better, right? Because this is like how the way you drive in a peaceful, liberal way the law forward, right? I hope that that's clear. So you even might have a duty to strategically disobey certain unjust laws, because this will, within the framework of existing legal frameworks, push the law forward to make it even more just. Okay, so I hope that's clear. If we are engaging in civil disobedience, we don't want to overthrow everything, right? So there's a general acceptance of the legal norms. You want to advance them, and therefore I think it gives us a strong argument to actually strategically, based on all the principles that I just put forward, to disobey the law. Again, we have to fulfill certain criteria, but these don't put a high burden on us necessarily, right? They basically say terrorism is not a good tool, revolution is not a good tool. Again, nothing that should surprise you coming from liberal theorists. If you look for good literature, I think these are mainly the points that people like John Rawls are making, Michael Walzer is making such claims, I think. So there's plenty of literature on this. And this is not something where you can spend nights and hours to read. There are just a couple of very seminal papers on the role of the civil disobedience. So I think it's worth the shot. But again, I try to summarize it as concise as possible here, what the role of civil disobedience is. So my first conclusion is, it seems that there actually is a duty to not obey or to disobey an unjust law, precisely because you want to advance the legal framework. Okay, however, let's get the big guns out, because I promised that already for a while. We have to talk about political authority, because some people might actually be skeptical whether the law has authority. And for that, I return to a couple of thought experiments. And for now, it will become a little bit obnoxious, but I also think fun. So this is a thought experiment from my friend Michael Humer, who wrote a very good book that I recommend, The Problem of Political Authority, which is very good. I highly recommend it. It's also very fun to read. So let me know in case you want to have a digital copy of it. Good. So here's the example. It's a neighborhood, and in this neighborhood there are vandals. Okay, and to stop the vandals, you basically say, okay, nobody's doing anything. I will do something against the vandals today. I will put those bandits into my basement. Okay, so you're kind of a vigilante. You go out, you capture the bandits, you capture these vandals who walk around in the neighborhood, you put them into your basement. Okay, so as good as it is, then you start to say, this actually cost me a lot of effort to put all these bandits into my basement. So now I need some money to make this a profitable business. So therefore you knock on each door in the neighborhood and say, well, did you notice that we don't have any vandals anymore in this neighborhood? And then your neighbors say, yeah, I appreciate that. That's great. Okay. Then you say, actually, I'm responsible for that. I put them into my basement. Okay. Then they say, I mean, I wouldn't endorse necessarily, but I mean, at least the vandals are not there anymore. They say, oh, but now you owe me $100 for this service because I put them into my basement. You don't have a problem anymore. So therefore you have to give me $100. And then the neighbors are saying like, why should I now pay you? I never asked you for doing such things and stuff like that. Why do I have to pay you $100? End of the story, you say, okay, I come back next week. Maybe you change your mind. Maybe you now appreciate that there will be no vandals anymore. Okay. Next week you come back, knock again, say, oh, again, still no vandals, right? It's a good life here in the neighborhood. You still have to pay me $100. Remember? Then they say, yeah, I decided I really don't want to pay those $100. Then they say, oh, then you come with me in the basement. So I give you another 2 days. Otherwise, you will also be in the basement with the other bandits, right? Because you didn't pay your fee. Then again, as you can imagine, 2 days later, you come, they resist, then you also drag them in the basement. And that's the part of the story. That sounds like a stupid example that I'm making. And like people are smiling at me in their cameras, but that's not so stupid. Like imagine, I mean, it sounds stupid when you make it about a private person. But isn't the state kind of making a very similar argument? Well, we put all those criminals away. We provide you with social order, and therefore you have to pay. We call this taxes. And when you don't pay the tax, also put you in our basement, but we call the basement prison. Damn. Well, Michael Humer thinks, and I guess that this is the problem of political authority, because what we find and what sounds so stupid for the individual person seems so true for the state, right? The state can do things that individuals can't. And we would actually find it like ridiculous if the individual would do what the state does. For example, making commands, making orders, issuing directives. If I would go into my neighborhood and say, oh, if you don't pay your fees to me, then I will put you into the basement. Like people would say, oh my God, who are you, man? So, but the state can do it. And the problem of political authority is to reason why the state has the ability to do things that ordinary people don't have. Okay, that's the summary of it. Why does the state, or might the state, have different properties that make it possible that state actors or the state itself can do things that ordinary persons cannot do? Okay, this is the whole problem of political authority, to ground this. This is the big problem. And you now see, hopefully, why this is relevant to the law. Because we always think that the state has rights to issue directives, issue the law, while if private persons would issue similar laws, it would not be possible, right? So let's dive into and look whether there are actually good reasons why the state has certain properties that individuals don't have. Good. Maybe I quickly return to Milena's question. It was about civil disobedience. Can you provide any example of civil disobedience? Because if I think about it, only protests in democratic countries come to mind, like Yellow Vests, but they might also escalate in something violent. I mean, it depends on your theory of justice. What depends also on what the particular law is that, but let's look at unjust discrimination of certain groups, right? Like you, again, Rosa Parks would be here an example. I mean, again, liberal democracies already assume that they have some background justice going on, that they are not fundamentally unjust. It really depends on the state of the country that we are talking about. Discriminatory laws would be one thing that you don't need in this sort to obey. So like, for example, civil disobedience to slavery, or discrimination, segregation, that was Luther King, right? Or to colonial rule, to privilege for certain groups, right? So these are things that immediately spark to mind. But actually, it's good for me to think about maybe one or two practical examples that I would throw in where I would think this happens in a liberal democracy. It doesn't seem, as you correctly note, it doesn't seem so easy to come up with examples, but maybe I have to think more, you know. So a good reminder, I will think more about this. I see also in the chat some people already discussing what could be the solution to the bandit. Daniel says, this is mob rule. Well, it's kind of vigilante justice, right? That I do the justice, but you know, why is it different? Like, why can the state do justice? I can't do justice because maybe I'm like, you know, look at me. I have innocent intentions. Why the state? and not me. I can also do good justice. And Ivan asks about, is this really again prognosis minimal state? We will talk about it in a second, so hold on. And yeah. And of course, Milena already throws in, okay, we have to do social contract theory. Yes, unfortunately, we have to do it, you know? So you could say, well, the state has authority because we are in a contract with them. So the most straightforward ideas, and I will separate them into a couple of categories that people have made arguments for authority. The first one, most prominent one, is on consent. So the state has authority because I consented to it. Like, you know, whatever. My wife or husband is bossing me around because I consented to this in like marriage or whatever. You know, my lawyer signs documents for me because I consented to that. The state does justice because I consented to the state, you know? That's explicit consent. Of course, I mean, I don't have to tell you all this, but these are very controversial arguments that we ever entered into a social contract. So explicit social contract theory, I don't even know who holds that view, but it would assume that we actually signed something ever, which I think we didn't. So let's skip to something maybe more plausible, like tacit consent. So maybe we didn't sign a real contract and nobody ever gave us like a social contract with all the obligations listed and stuff. Maybe there's tacit consent. That's actually the favorite argument of many of my students. Like because I'm here in the country, I kind of agree to the rules. So I gave my consent to it because I also don't do really anything about it. I kind of accept it, right? It's like I would live in this neighborhood where like the vigilante justice person is coming around and stuff, right? The problem is manifold, and I could give like multiple lectures on that. I think the most common objection to tacit consent is actually coming on very reasonable grounds from David Hume that says, well, is it really consent if you don't have really any valuable and reasonable options? So he makes the example of the poor peasant farmer that would have to migrate out of the country to not tacitly consent, right? If I, for example, disagree with the fundamental legal framework of Germany or whatever, I would have to move to countries where I don't know the family, where I don't have my family, where I don't have friends, where I don't know the language, where I actually don't, can make an income. So that's just a lot to ask, you know. So tacit consent is also very shaky. I think in another essay, I guess Hume makes it clear that, well, tacit consent kind of works like you're on a ship, and the other option that you basically have is to not consent, is to jump into the water. So the other options seem like rather grim, right? Is it really consenting? Can we take this as consent in a meaningful way? So I think tacit consent also has its problems. But I just want, for now, my only task is here not to fully convince you. I just want to give you some lines of why people might be skeptical about it. Maybe you are a hardcore tacit consent fan, and that's like your jam. You have the perfect defense of tacit consent. That's fine. I just want to say some people don't find tacit consent so plausible, and therefore they might already still remain skeptical. Next one is hypothetical consent. You might just think, okay, maybe I didn't explicitly consent. Maybe I didn't do tacit consent, like implicit consent, but maybe I would hypothetically consent. Okay, that's also possible. So hypothetical consent is something we know. For example, if you are like unconscious and you're delivered to the hospital, somehow the doctor has to make a decision on behalf of you, right? And they give you the treatment because they think you hypothetically consent. And then afterwards, once you're conscious again, you say, oh, thank you, doctor, you saved me. And then they're like, I got the hypothetical thing right, yeah, the hypothetical consent. Well, is it really true that the state gets hypothetical consent? Well, again, some people find it plausible. Others, however, think that this is also implausible because you can always ask people. They're not unconscious 24/7. It's really easy. You can actually send out a letter to the state, you know, like, oh, would you consent to this? Yes, no. I don't know. With the text declaration, you could actually send it out. So I don't also think that flies. And that puts the whole problem of consent out there. I just very briefly sketched some rough arguments that people could make against consent and social contract theory. In fact, many people say that social contract theory is actually another good way to think about the state. Why? Because the basic features of a contract never apply when we apply it to the state suddenly. For example, one feature of a contract with a contract between individuals, for example, would be mutual obligation. You sell me the bread, I deliver the money, right? Mutual obligation. A contract has clearly stated mutual obligations. For the state and me, I pay my taxes, but I can never ask the state to explicitly deliver goods to me. There are many Supreme Court cases where actually the Supreme Court ruled that you cannot demand, for example, legal protection. You know, the police forces make a judgment on behalf of society in general, not on behalf of you. Like, so you cannot order, like today, I don't feel well, please, officer, can you come and provide me with security that I pay for, right? Doesn't seem to work out. So there is a sense of very blurry mutual obligations. So at least there's reasonable skepticism, and that's what I want to establish. Maybe you want to defend it, but again, I'm just here to give you some, at least lines of being skeptical about social contract theory. But okay, so you might say, okay, maybe social contract theory doesn't do the job. What are other arguments how you can ground that the state can issue directives and laws that others can't? Well, here's another argument. For example, fair play. So you might say, because everybody else obeys the law and everybody else contributes to the state, and the state is something good, I also have to contribute. Okay. So for example, imagine that you're on a road trip and the car cracks down. And like, let's say you are 5 people and your 4 friends are pushing the car, and afterwards you continue and you're just standing there and like, oh, that sounds difficult, you know, looks like difficult stuff, and your friends really push the car and stuff, and you are like just standing next there. And once they push the car, after you have had like a breakdown of the car and it goes again, then you say, oh, let me jump on again. Okay, that seems kind of unfair because you really didn't contribute to the collective effort. So it doesn't seem fair. And the same might be true for the law or the state. Well, everybody is obeying the law, and everybody generates a lot of benefits for all of us as society by obeying the law, but you are not contributing to that. That seems unfair, right? And maybe you have a duty, actually. If somebody engages in a collective project and you're not doing your fair due, maybe you're actually doing something wrong. Well, several problems. Somebody in the chat mentioned already Robert Nozick. Well, Robert Nozick objects famously to this and says, well, you know, merely receiving benefits from something is not the same as consenting, right? Especially, which brings me to the next step, is if there are no other options. For example, if I don't contribute to the state or to state-owned services, but receiving the benefits from them, I also don't have much other choice. I could not drive on other roads than the government provides. I could not provide other legal frameworks. You know, there's only one law, for example. So how would I actually receive benefits from something else? The state has a monopoly. So therefore, I basically cannot do anything else than receiving the benefits. The question that also some people ask is the state really like enhancing social cooperation? But we can take that for granted for now. And does that really apply to all sorts of laws or just particular ones? But I think these are weaker objections. Good. Let me just quickly check the chat. Yeah, Daniela, you can write. I would be curious to see how you would weigh that, how you fair play and to a certain degree. But I mean, yeah, let's keep that for the Q&A. Maybe I can ask you directly then to explain what you mean. Just because I have two or three more concepts, and then we're basically at the end. So that seems like an interesting question. For now, I would say a lot of people, if I look at the literature, in fact, a lot of people are very skeptical about social contract arguments. They're very skeptical about fair play, although I would say fair play gets a lot of credit these days. And then there's another thing why you should maybe obey the law and why the state has this specific authority. Well, because you might say it correlates with other duties that we have. Actually, we have to obey the law because the law maximizes utility, you know, like, and I'm a utilitarian, so therefore I have a duty to obey the law, okay? Or, as John Rawls says, you know, you have a natural duty to justice, that you create a just world, so therefore you have to kind of advance just institutions. Or you can say, I actually have to obey the law because it reflects morality, right? And you have a duty to reflect morality. So, for example, as I said, with content independence, you have a natural duty not to murder other human beings, and therefore you have to obey the law to not murder, right? That might be something of an argument. However, these are all suffering from the very same problem, that they are indeterminate in what they ask you from. It seems like, especially the last one, asks you to only endorse specific laws, namely those that reflects already morality, right? And then it's the question whether we really would need the law, because if you already have a duty to advance morality, why would you need the law, right? So this seems like, what's the distinct feature of the law, and why is the state taking care of all of this? You know, why do I have to, if I have a duty to be moral, why does the state have a specific role in advancing morality here? And I get an obligation by them being the state. So that's kind of natural duty arguments. I don't want to spend too much time on that because I'm already short on time, and I want to get you a little bit from your questions. Here are two other people that make interesting arguments that you might want to check out, like David Astlund. He's like a political philosopher at Brown. He kind of makes a lot of majority-based arguments, like democracy-based arguments, you know. I tend to be very skeptical about those, but at least they're interesting the way he construes them. So you might want to check that out. So, for example, I would object to some of the democracy arguments is, you know, for example, you could say, we all kind of consented because we engaged in a common practice, right? We elected the state by democratic procedures, we debated it, we had a discourse about it, and therefore it has some moral power on us. Well, again, the way Michael Huemer thinks about it, and also I think about it, this might be, we might have a similar intuition about the state, but now let's look about private persons. Imagine the following case. If we would meet in person at one point, we hopefully would go somewhere in St. Petersburg or Moscow or wherever, in a club or in a bar, and have like a drink. You would introduce me to the local drink scene. And then after we had like multiple drinks, you would say, well, you told us so much about democracy. Let's have a democratic vote. Who pays the bill? Then all of you say like, oh, Sven pays the bill. Then I say, oh, I'm against that. Then they say, well, but we are deliberative, so we also have a discussion about it. So then you're like, for 20 minutes, you discuss, oh, should Sven pay the bill? And some people say yes. I mean, you know, for whatever reason, you know. And then I can also partake in that discussion. So I want to convince you, no, I shouldn't pay the bill because, you know, I'm a philosopher, I already have no money, you know, blah, blah, blah. And then we all get into this discussion. In the end, we take another vote, but since we all know you want me to pay, so again, same vote outcome, but we debated, and I gave my vote and I had my right to participate. Do I have to obey this? I don't know. Like, for me, majority-based arguments also fail, okay, based on these grounds. They seem like weak when it comes to interpersonal exchange and not to the crowded intuitions about the state. And this is, Kid Wellman. Unfortunately, he has a very bad picture only of himself, so it looks like a bit pixeled. He makes kind of a Good Samaritan argument, which basically says, yeah, the state and the law actually just prevents us from being the Hobbesian state of nature. And if you don't want to live in the Hobbesian state of nature, well, you kind of have to accept that we give the state certain authorities and the law has this authority, right? Because that's kind of the main way the state orders society. Okay, plausible. And this is called the Good Samaritan argument because it basically says you have a natural duty to rescue people from like very abysmal conditions. And like the state of nature would be very abysmal, like would be very, very bad. Therefore, we have obligations to prevent that. So therefore, we give the state political authority, which gives him the possibility to issue directives such as the law. Good. That's kind of the main arguments. But as you can see, people tend to be very skeptical about that. Okay, so let me just quickly jump off of this. So where does that leave us? Of course, in this short period of time, I cannot debunk all of these incredibly robust philosophical arguments, but at least I try to show you that on all of the major arguments, you can be at least skeptical whether there's a duty that the state has, or whether there is something called political obligation, so that the state can do things that ordinary persons cannot do. So if you are skeptical already about political authority, this puts the overall law into question. Because the main issue, main way the state orders society is by issuing directives that normal persons cannot issue. I mean, I would have many laws that I want to issue, but I cannot issue them, right? I mean, I could, but nobody would have a duty to obey them. However, if the state issues stuff that if I would issue them would not have to be obeyed. That's the big problem of political authority, right? State can issue directives that if they would be issued by anybody else would have no moral power. But if they are offered by the state or issued by the state, they have a moral power. And I argued that, well, you should at least be skeptical about it from a philosophical perspective, because there are many good objections to them. So maybe you want to be a philosophical anarchist. What is a philosophical anarchist? Well, a philosophical anarchist sounds super cool. It basically brings together the two lamest words in the whole literature, like philosophy and anarchism. So, like combining two minuses gets you like a plus in the end, maybe. So if you want to be fancy at a party, you can say, well, I'm not an anarchist, I don't throw Molotov cocktails. I'm not revolutionary. I am what is called a philosophical anarchist. And a philosophical anarchist basically just doesn't accept political authority. They don't think that there is a moral duty to obey or a general normative duty to obey the law. However, there might be good instrumental reasons or whatever to obey the law or whatever, to comply with the law for sure. But they remain very skeptical about this specific role of the state and are therefore inherently skeptical about it. If you think that this is some crazy town, well, I would say this is the dominant position right now in political theory of political authority. If you Google political authority and political obligation, this is arguments that you will encounter. In fact, people like John Simmons are dominating the discourse. Michael Huemer is also somebody very prominent in the discourse. So this is not some fringe stuff that I cook up. I just introduced you to, I would say, some of the most common arguments in the literature. However, I also want to make my own contribution, like this. And that's what everybody wants to do at one point. I like this argument. It's kind of a modification of what John Hasnas talks about. Unfortunately, I cannot type all these names in the chat because my damn keyboard, but maybe I can follow up later. But John Hasnas has a paper, is there a moral duty to obey the law? He even calls it. And he makes a very, very interesting argument that I think is especially for classical liberals interesting, because it comes from Hayek and spontaneous order theory. Well, he says, first of all, detach the question of the state and the law. Okay, so don't think like, okay, political authority and the state have to be intertwined. Rather think of the law as a discovery process. The law is not something that is issued and then has moral power, but the law is an institution that gets us closer to our natural duties. For example, the law helps us to solve puzzles of justice. The law solves, like through interaction, helps us to solve puzzles about values and morality. And he appeals here to something that is common law. I don't know how familiar you are with common law, but common law is the process that the law is not made by the state, but the law comes out of jury cases, out of legal proceedings. So the law basically is millions and millions of court cases then codified. Okay, so it's not something that is debated in whatever the parliament, the Duma, whatever, or signed by the president. That's not what the law is in this framework. Rather, the law is millions of different court cases where ordinary people engage in disputes, right? And solve these disputes. And he thinks that this gives us much more information about what our natural duties are, the duties to justice, the duties to social peace, and the duties to morality. And therefore, we might have a duty to obey a common law framework. And I think that is actually very persuasive. And as you can see, already a very different spin on the overall thing. So I was already going on too long. That kind of my little intervention. Whether there's a duty to obey an unjust law, actually seems is quite the opposite. There is a duty to disobey unjust laws in civil disobedience. So if you're not skeptical about the authority of law, but even you might be skeptical about the authority of the law by questioning the biggest question in political philosophy, namely political authority. So I hope I clarified some of the concepts. I still have some time for questions. So whoever has questions, please let me know. I'm just trying to catch up with the chat now as well. Yeah, I guess Maria's comment was on something, sounds like something illegal in Russia. Yeah, I mean, philosophical anarchism, philosophizing plus anarchism. But don't worry, like philosophical anarchists are usually very kind people and they wear suits all the time. Is there a good law against the state where micro? I don't know the book, so I will have to save it. So thanks, Julia, for recommending. Then we had earlier, I think, Daniel had a question about combining consent and fair play. Maybe you want to elaborate on that. And then I have also somebody on Habermas who was that. It was Julia. I'm not big on Habermas, so Julia, you actually might enlighten me there. But yeah, first Daniel maybe.
Okay, so as far as I know, one of the questions that concern political philosophers is how to justify political obligation to those who must obey. And I guess in real life, like in non-ideal theory, whatever it's called, we can say that all these features, all these means come in handy and they work together. Like there is kind of a tacit consent because when you are born in the country, um, and when you grow up, you realize you are not okay with the laws of this country. You kind of didn't sign anywhere that you agree with that. But anyway, you live according to these laws, and then you have a chance either to demonstrate that you are not okay with these laws and somehow show that your consent is over. And on the other hand, you can provide this social contract within the state on the side of both authority and citizens, that you kind of support fair play. For example, if you don't like something, you can be elected and try to influence on changing policies and existing laws, for example. Yeah, something like that. So that's why I guess it can work together.
Yeah, I mean, to a certain degree, it could be. I mean, philosophically, I don't see that there is a compositional effect, to say, okay, all of them together make it up. I would say there has to be like one foundational argument. However, in common perception, I agree with you that people I mean, it's not that people wake up in the morning and really question the state, right? Like that they are saying, oh my God, there is no political obligation. Like, what are we doing here? That's like the ultimate red pill, right? However, I think that is more with the way the state is also set up, linked. So Michael Humer has in his book a whole subchapter on how authority is kind of put forward in also human psychology, right? Like, for example, there are like interesting studies where people walk around just in uniforms. They don't have any position. And then they ask people for money and stuff, like they have to pay a fee. And people do it because they have a uniform, right? So the way we play with authority and the way role authority has in our mindsets and the way it is set up and the state uses this, just think about state buildings. Like they if you would be an alien and you come to the world and you look at state buildings, you're like, wow, that must be important, right? In any city. right? That gives you a sense of authority. And I think there is also some truth to that. I'm not sure theoretically whether all these effects can be combined. I think there has to be one overarching good argument that grounds it in terms of really metaphysical, or like metaphysics is wrong, like theoretical grounding. And there I might be skeptical about most arguments. Again, I don't want to. I'm far beyond suggesting that there is a takedown of political authority. All I'm suggesting is there's one could be reasonably skeptical about it. Okay, that's all I'm saying. You could be reasonably skeptical, and that's what many people in the literature are. I think, in fact, the mainstream is skeptical about political authority. So then it was Julia it was about Habermas, and I already excused myself because I'm not very good with Habermas yet, but it's on my list. So Julia, please.
Sorry, I apologize for such question. Thank you, Sven, for such an interesting topic. So my question was about Habermas' conceptual distinction between consensus and compromise, the basic, how to say, the principal distinction between it is consensus-oriented communication. You have to not only consider all the differences and say political views of the speakers. You have to find a solution that sort of encompasses all these. Sorry for my English. That's the solution that encompasses all the differences and sort of combining in a productive way, in a non-conflictual way, whether in compromise-oriented communication, you don't have to find a solution that eliminates some differences, but rather recognize these differences in political views, in ways of thinking, etc. If I put it correctly, sort of. So whether you just consider these differences in ways of thinking, or you justify and you recognize these differences and try to find a solution that encompasses all these differences in non-conflictual way. So that was my question, if you find this distinction productive. Yeah, thank you.
The question ultimately must be like, how do we deal with dissenters? Like, even if I set up in this framework a social contract theory to a certain degree, or a democratic process that reflects these principles, right? So I could set up a democratic consensus, or like a democratic decision-making procedure that comes closest to the grounding somehow a social contract. How do we deal with people who explicitly dissent or whatsoever? How could compromise or consent deal with such issues? And of course, for me as a political economist, what are the institutions and how are they set up, right? In the end, like, for example, in the democracy argument, what is always interesting is you can always end up actually with laws through the way a specific vote is set up that are not in the interest of the majority of people, right? So I would need to see the institutional structures. You know, we have talked about Arrow's paradox and stuff like that in political theory, like the way the how question is asked, the way how it proceeds, how the way the law is generated, the what people are asked and which stages has interesting implications. But again, I give it more thought. You can also drop me an email. Like I share my contacts here to let me think about such questions in deeper when I have made up my mind. Since I cannot type, here are for people to my contact details. So you can check that out. And you can always drop me an email. I'm very responsive, and no worries. I'm always happy to engage with you. If I have 2 or 3 more minutes, I just go over the chat, because Daniel's question, I mean, that's much, I would say, more general. I'm not very metaphysical, so I'm more of a pragmatist in the end. You know, I just think metaphysics is at the end a very, very big danger. So, but again, that's a huge discussion. Maybe that's something we should actually touch upon in one of the upcoming years whatsoever. I think metaphysics, and especially politics, is very dangerous, I think. But Also, how do you do politics without metaphysics? The old Rawlsian question. Good. Any other questions?
Yes.
That you might
Can I
please,
ask?
yes, please.
Okay, so I have in mind a really interesting thought experiment. Yes, I just don't know how to resolve it. So just brief description. Yes, we can come back to Hitler, for example. Yes. And Hitler comes to power, and you are the Weimar judge, yes. And so we have an agreement about unjust laws, unjust Nazi laws. So you are the normal Weimar judge, yes. And so you must apply now the Russia laws, and so you must to choose. Yes, you can quit. Yes, of course, it's your right, but you can continue to work and save many people, for example, yes, under Nazis regime. So what's the right decision?
I mean, that's part of my dissertation, right? How to have individual responsibility in morally corrupt systems. So let's say, like, my government is doing something immoral. What is my role of participating, and how can I make these trade-offs? I'm skeptical about knowing the effects. So I'm very influenced by people that are skeptical about intended action. So it needs to be really proven that you can save so many lives in like doing some morally corrupt things. For me, you can always spin effects like, okay, you maintain an ineffective and immoral system, right? Instead of resisting to it. But on the other hand side, you can also say, actually, I get a lot of advantages because, or I generate a lot of benefits because the system wouldn't go nevertheless anyways down. So I at least use it for some good things, right? So this is kind of a at the margin debate of stuff. I don't know what is the right answer to that. What is your verdict, Ivan? How would you judge?
I try a little bit to continue to work, but when I feel uncomfortable with, of course, it's right to quit, and so I quit.
Yeah, so there's an interesting paper by Bernard Williams. Bernard Williams advances somehow the argument that you don't want to dirty your hands. Okay, so even if you could save a majority, but you are kind of involved in like the thing, it corrupts you. And I think it's a common intuition, very powerful. Like people did like the trolley problem in real life, and people really didn't want to interfere because, you know, making a decision already is kind of bringing you into a dilemma. So I always have highest respect for people who actually want to engage in something and have the sincerity and the clarity to do so. However, I just question whether they have actually the right outcomes in mind. So for me, I think for most people, actually maybe abstaining from such practices is the best way. In my dissertation, spoiler alert, I argue that even for democracy, abstaining sometimes in very difficult elections is, for example, between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, let's say, I might just say it's reasonable to abstain. But again, do not dirty your hands. And that's controversial. And it is like 80 pages long, only this argument. So it takes a lot of things to get there. Anyways, I think that's it for this time, unless people have urgent questions. And you can always reach out to me. Unfortunately, I could not type in the chat. I'm sorry, Julia, for being so vague on the question. Like, send it along to me. I will think more about it. Again, Habermas is not my strength overall, but I would give it another go if I have some more time to think about it.